Now today, we're diving into something which has literally just happened and has the potential to really shake things up. And that is what the election of Zohran Mamdani as mayor of New York City means for the future of the good herb in the Big Apple. Specifically, the legal weed industry, culture, regulation, social impact, and a whole lot more. Now Zohran Mamdani ran as a democratic socialist, and that in itself raises some interesting intersections. In particular, the combination of weed policy and politics, New York's evolving urban landscape, and of course, the culture. So in today's show, we'll walk through his background, his campaign, how he was able to execute it successfully and become the mayor of New York City, also how socialism and communism may or may not relate, and how all this can connect to or impact the cannabis market, and of course how his religion and culture may play into all this. So without further ado, let's just jump right in. Now let's start off with the moment that a lot of cannabis enthusiasts stood up and took notice, and that is in a recent New York City mayoral debate where moderators asked the candidates, have you ever purchased anything in a cannabis shop? And according to reports, Zohran Mamdani answered in the affirmative. He said yes, he purchased weed at a legal dispensary. And that led to a lot of pages like High Times and Mary Jane Berlin all the way in Germany actually reposting it. Check it out.
Mamdani?
I have. I have purchased at a legal shop.
Okay. Mr. Mamdani?
I have. I have purchased at a legal shop.
Okay.
So a lot of folks all around the world, including in Germany, stood up and took notice at this mayoral appointment. Now, despite the fact that I personally was not a fan of some of these pages reposting this, it seemed to me like a cheap ploy to score political points. But that said, it is important because it signals that he has personally participated in the legal cannabis market in New York, and that may mean that he is comfortable publicly with the concept of regulated adult use rather than hiding it. Now, for the cannabis industry, a mayor who says something like that may open doors figuratively to friendlier regulation, though of course that's no guarantee. Now, to understand Zohran's politics and how some of this may or may not impact everything, you have to look at his background. Now, Zohran is a very intelligent guy and he's well spoken. He was born on October the 18th, 1991. He was born to Indian Muslim parents and moved to New York with his family at a young age. Now, despite being born in Uganda, Zohran's family was by no means poor. They lived in an upscale neighborhood described as one of the richest areas in Uganda, and the images of their home is quite lavish, including an estate with lake views and monkeys. He even had a 3-day-long event for his lavish wedding.
In an interview in South Africa, he sounded a little different.
I actually created a playlist for Mira, who also happens to be my mother. Nepotism and hard work goes a long way.
And in an interview with the Turkish-American podcast, Mamdani sounded different again.
I'll be honest with you, Brother Mansoom, is that at this point, not many people are thinking about it.
Prior to running for mayor, he was a member of the New York State Assembly representing the 36th District in Queens. He announced his run for New York City mayor in 2025 and ran a campaign focused on affordability, housing, transportation, and social justice. He defeated much more established figures, including the former governor Andrew Cuomo, in the Democratic primary in June 2025. Now, what's pretty interesting is that for someone who's always screaming about tax the rich and getting rid of billionaires in the wider capitalist society, Zohran also had the support and backing of the Soros family, who often funneled millions upon millions of dollars to his socialist causes. He even posed with a Soros heir in a penthouse photo which recently went viral. His campaign in particular was built on a coalition of younger voters, as well as diverse communities, immigrant, Muslim, South Asian, Latino, and he also emphasized the cost of living relief. According to People.com, he became the first Muslim and South Asian mayor of New York City, or the first Muslim mayor of one of the biggest US cities, period. And that's historic. So in summary, Mamdani is a relative newcomer. Some would describe him as a grassroots organizer turned elected politician who rode a wave of frustration at high cost of living and promises big changes. But it's not without controversy, so let's dig into his democratic socialist stance and what socialism actually is. Now, what we're going to do is describe socialism, democratic socialism, and communism, and how they may be similar or how they may be different. Now, at a high level, socialism is a political and economic ideology that emphasizes collective or social ownership of the means of production. I'm talking industry and major services, as opposed to purely private ownership, as well as as redistribution of wealth so that basic needs, housing, healthcare, and education are all met. Now, in practice, this has led to a reality of many different forms of socialism, many different varieties, some more radical and some more moderate. So contrast that then with democratic socialism. Democratic socialism is a variant of socialism that emphasizes the democratic political process, i.e. free elections and civil liberties, but it also pairs that with socialist economic goals, that is public ownership or heavy regulation, strong welfare state, and worker empowerment.
You moved to America from Venezuela, fleeing socialism and Hugo Chavez. You live in New York City today. Zohran will be our next mayor. How does that make you feel?
Clearly, nobody is safe because we are the most prosperous and freest nation in the world, America. We're also the number one target for these people. The DSA is not an organic organization. Since World War II, since the Cold War, there are foreign powers trying to destroy America from the inside. I mean, why do you think the Cuban government funds spies? Why do you think China tries to do that? Why do you think Russia tries to influence US elections? Because they know that they cannot invade us, but they can try to conquer us democratically.
There's this signaling mechanism within a lot of culturally Marxist people, which is, even though Zohran comes from money, he likes to let the world know that he's one of the people by making videos where he's eating with his hand
I know,
and
I saw that. I hate it.
dressing like people from back in India. There's this active signaling that I don't come from money and I'm just like y'all and I get to speak on the behalf of working class.
Chavez said literally, being rich is bad. Ser rico es malo, with a Rolex on his wrist. I mean, this is who the Marxists are. It's the same as Mamdani saying there should be no billionaires at the same time his mom is super rich and he has 3 wedding events. I am not criticizing his wealth. I am criticizing his hypocrisy. I never thought about social issues much. I thought about economic issues because that's all we thought about in Venezuela. You know, we are against socialism, at least in my family.
Are you saying that in Venezuela people don't obsess over gender stuff?
No, because we're not rich enough to do it.
Now, in the US context, politicians who call themselves democratic socialists often mean much stronger public investment in social goods, higher taxes on the rich, stronger labor rights, large public programs, rather than full removal of the market economy. Now, there are many examples of socialist policies that one can point to. When we're talking about public ownership or municipal ownership of services, think of things like transport, utilities, housing. Also think of strong welfare states, places with universal childcare, free or near free healthcare, and of course there's higher taxes on wealth and corporations, and workers' councils and cooperatives provide greater workplace democracy. Now, there are classic examples throughout history where socialism has been applied and unsuccessfully so. Some classic examples include the Soviet Union. The USSR attempted to command economy under Marxist-Leninist socialism, and their socialism collapsed due to inefficiencies, authoritarianism, and also economic stagnation. Now, a lot of folks will also point to Venezuela under Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro as they adopted strong socialist rhetoric and broad nationalizations. The economy collapsed, hyperinflation and shortages occurred, and political repression was massive. Now, other countries with heavy socialist or communist economies include places like Cuba, North Korea, and they have seen limited political freedom, economic hardship, centralized control rather than democratic socialism.
We have a vision for a society, we must fight for it up their position. And to make it very clear that when we have a vision for a society, we must fight for it across every single section of it. So just because the state assembly can't legislate on it doesn't mean that I shouldn't make clear that this is how I feel about what our city should be doing.
So the point here is that socialism in its radical or authoritarian form has many historical failures. Democratic socialism tries to avoid these by preserving democracy and some market mechanisms, but it still faces major challenges and the end goal is still pretty much the same. Now, a lot of folks will say that Democrat socialists try to avoid the plagued issues with socialism by having a few differences, but there are also a few similarities that definitely need to be pointed out. For one, democratic socialists and socialists both believe that the current capitalist model produces inequality and concentrates on wealth and power and leaves many without basic services or security. Both socialists and democratic socialists typically favor more public ownership, stronger regulation of businesses, redistribution of wealth, and social welfare programs. The key difference here usually lies in the method and scope. A socialist, particularly in the more radical sense, may call for full public ownership of major industries while also abolishing private property in production and possibly non-democratic means. But on the other hand, a democratic socialist explicitly emphasizes democracy and often accepts a mixed economy with both public and private sectors. In short, democratic socialists are socialists who emphasize democratic processes and are usually more incremental. Socialists in a broader sense may be a little bit more radical.
Socialism. Terrifying word.
Now there's another socialist policy and one of the less discussed but meaningful connections, and that is some socialist movements and publications argue that open borders or much more liberal immigration policies align with workers' solidarity. Now here's their logic when it comes to this. Borders restrict movement. It keeps workers divided, which weakens collective bargaining and allows employers to exploit cheap labor and maintains national divisions as part of capitalist control. In that view, open borders are a way to empower workers globally, create solidarity across nations rather than competition, as well as break down traditional national hierarchies. Now this idea is controversial even within left-leaning liberal politics, but if a politician identifies with democratic socialism, one might expect more openness to immigrants, refugee rights, and less restrictive border policies. Now in the case of Zohran Mamdani, given his own immigrant background, born in Uganda, of South Asian heritage, and campaign outreach to immigrant communities, one can infer that his policies might lean toward more inclusive immigration, which can tie into open borders rhetoric in some socialist frameworks. Now, there are a lot of folks, including President Trump, who have labeled Zohran Mamdani as a communist.
Like this communist from New York someday gets elected. I can't believe that's happening. That's a terrible thing for our country, by the way. He's a communist. We're going to go to a communistic state. That's so bad for New York. Congressional Democrats wish to do to America. Just look at the result of yesterday's election in New York, where their party installed a communist as the mayor of the largest city in the nation.
And that begs the question, what is communism? Well, in its most basic form, communism is a political and economic ideology that advocates for a classless society, abolition of private ownership of the means of production, collective ownership of all major resources, distribution from each according to ability to each according to need. In practice, many communist regimes, Soviet Union, Mao's China, etc., have centralized control of industry, no competitive market economy, one-party rule, restricted democracy, and civil liberties. So that said, what are some of Mamdani's policies that critics say resemble communism? Well, for one, he proposes city-owned grocery stores that will buy at wholesale and sell at lower costs. Effectively, municipal ownership of retail in a sector usually dominated by private businesses. He also proposes making city bus fares free and freezing rents for many tenants across New York City. In addition, he also proposes public ownership or subsidy of many services. And according to CBS News and The Washington Post, he supports raising the minimum wage to $30 an hour, increasing corporate tax, taxing millionaires, all of which shift resources from private to public welfare. Now, while there are many people who are happy that he was elected, there are some critics, and some conservatives and centrists have labeled him a communist or radical socialist.
Every so-called communist country is actually a socialist country, with the state controlling employment and economy to some degree. Even the widely referred to Communist Russia was actually called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. In short, socialism and communism are not altogether different. Rather, most schools of economics consider socialism to be a precursor to communism once the state has enough control over society and economy. But this total control is a major reason that socialist countries struggle to reach this ideal. Corruption is rampant in countries like the former USSR, Venezuela, Vietnam, and North Korea, largely due to people in power abusing that power instead of using it to help the society they control, and refusing to give up that power to the people.
We will expand the city's special enforcement programs, doubling fines for hazardous violations and tripling them for conditions that are immediately dangerous. And when a really bad landlord, like this guy, refuses to fix it, the city's going to step in, make the repairs, and send them the bill.
Watch next.
If that doesn't work, the city's taking over the building. We're putting the worst landlords out of business.
He says, we're going to take over the building. So it's theirs. It's the city's.
So you mean like seize the means of production,
That's
like
exactly
communists?
Wait a minute.
So he's saying the quiet part out loud.
Yes.
And people voted for it.
That's right.
So you can imagine, in a situation like that where there's one party control, it's gone full socialist or full communist, obviously a lot of those countries don't allow the good herb. Now, socialism alone doesn't necessarily mean that weed will be banned. Now, it's important to note that there are many social democratic states in Europe like Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, which have to some extent liberalized cannabis, at least for medical use. But even those medical programs are heavily regulated, and possession of small amounts can still land you in jail. Now, when it comes to communist countries in general, most of them have very strict cannabis or drug laws. For example, places like Russia, China, Cuba, Laos, Vietnam, all of these have communist legacies and very harsh laws when it comes to the good herb.
Well, another American is in custody in Moscow after customs officials allegedly found cannabis-laced marmalade in his luggage. 28-year-old Caleb Wayne Byers is in custody for 30 days pending investigation. Moscow authorities say a drug-sniffing dog flagged his bag during a routine check. Inspectors discovered 2 plastic jars and a pouch with cannabis-based sweets. Byers claim they were medically prescribed in the U.S. for travel use.
So to sum it all up, in many communist or socialist countries, or even Democrat socialist countries, you guys can see that it's still heavily restricted. There's still penalties, fines, and potential jail time. Now, thankfully, when it comes to New York City, and in Mamdani's context, New York is a state where cannabis is legal. So his role is more about city regulation, industry, equity, community reinvestment, rather than foundational legality. Now, another reason why Zohran's election would be historic is that he will be the first Muslim mayor of New York City. It's the biggest city in America. Now, for Zohran, his camp, and the wider Muslim community, this is big. This matters culturally, symbolically, and politically, and a lot of folks will point to increased representation of Muslim communities, immigrant heritage, and also broader diversity in city leadership. Because cannabis policy intersects with communities that have been heavily impacted by prohibition, including many minority and immigrant communities, his identity might shape how he thinks about equity in the cannabis industry. Now, Zohran is not the first Muslim to be mayor of a large city. Let's look at a few other big cities with Muslim mayors or large Muslim populations. First off, we got London, and this is Sadiq Khan. Sadiq Khan has been the mayor of London since 2016 and is a Muslim of Pakistani heritage. Under his leadership, London has seen changes, increased investment in infrastructure, transport and cross-rail, more affordable housing policies, efforts to reduce air pollution, promote tech startups, and manage immigration and multicultural integration. When it comes to cannabis policy, however, Khan has publicly stated that he does not support the legalization of cannabis for recreational use in London. As mayor of London, Sadiq Khan instead focused on enforcement, regulation, and preventing young people's use. Now, there are critics who argue that London's housing and rent costs remains extremely high, gentrification continues, inequality persists, and some feel that the influx of global capital and immigrants have driven up rents and made life harder for many Londoners. Conversely, supporters say that the multicultural economy has revitalized parts of London, made it more dynamic and global. Now, another large city with a significant Muslim population is Birmingham, UK. Birmingham has a large Muslim population and diverse ethnic communities. Its leadership and city policies have also led to issues with managing multiculturalism, integration, housing, employment, and also urban challenges. Now, since having a more diverse leadership in Birmingham, some positive changes have been seen. Increased representation of minority and ethnic groups in civic life, more attention to inclusive economic policies, and growth in tech and entrepreneurial sectors among second-generation immigrant communities. On the flip side, however, some folks point to negative factors such as inequality remaining, housing and rent pressures persisting, drug use being maintained, some communities still feel a bit left behind, and in general, a whole lot more lawlessness.
Holy
Not too good.
Not too good. Too many people fighting, you know.
Rice milk and plus yogurt.
And I like Trump as well.
You like Trump?
Yeah, I like Trump.
Now, when it comes to the good herb, neither London nor Birmingham have legalized for recreational use. It's still pretty restricted. And what this shows is that it's not up to one person, but rather the local and regulatory framework, national law, political culture, those things matter a lot. Now bringing it back to Zohran in New York City, with the increase of Muslim culture in big cities, will there be a conflict with existing laws and cultures? Well, this is a complex question, and the short answer is yes, possibly, and much depends on how integration, representation, and policy are handled. Now, as we've seen in places like the UK, when a growing Muslim immigrant or Islamic heritage culture becomes more visible in a city, there can be cultural tensions, differences in norms, religious dress, halal food, weekend and holiday observance, political values, generational divides, immigrant versus established communities, and some of these lawmakers will be tasked with making some of those newcomers feel welcome, and they'll have to set up shop and set up mosques and stuff like that where they can do their thing. And this is because local cities will have to reconcile religious practices with secular law. For example, religious arbitration, Sharia councils, financial practices, dress codes, alcohol laws. And if it's not managed, these things can definitely cause issues within the community. Now, specifically when it comes to cannabis, many Muslim traditions forbid alcohol and recreational intoxicants, but a Muslim mayor may face the expectation from some in his community to align with those values, or at the very least balance them with a broad public policy for all. Now, even more broadly than that, a city's legal system is secular. Religious communities must follow civic law. If a mayor embraces multicultural pluralism, he must ensure equal treatment under the law, protect civil liberties, but also ensure integration and cohesion rather than segregation. And historically, as cities become more diverse, issues and troubles can arise around housing, schooling, policing, social services, and also employment, in particular between immigrants and natives. But the city itself also benefits from the economic energy, entrepreneurship, global connections, and innovations that immigrant and Muslim communities often bring. So yes, there may be some conflicts, but with good leadership, which is not necessarily what we've seen across other countries, it can be mitigated with good policy and inclusive governance. Now, something else that a lot of folks point to is Sharia law and how it interacts with state or federal law, and they also point to UK examples of Sharia councils.
Right next door, Iran was not far behind. It was at par with the Western world. Women could step out without a veil, even meet men at public places. But the Iran and Afghanistan of today are a lot different. Today, hijab is mandatory, Western clothing is frowned upon, clerics dictate societal norms, religious police patrols the streets, civil rights are all but non-existent. What happened in these countries? They came under the Sharia law.
Now, Sharia law is a system of moral and legal principles derived from the Quran and centuries of Islamic jurisprudence. It covers personal behavior, family law, marriage, divorce, inheritance, financial transactions, and religious duties. Now, in secular states like the United States, the legal system is separate from religious law. Sharia law is not binding in U.S. courts. The U.S. Constitution and state laws take precedence. However, Muslims may voluntarily use Islamic principles in personal contracts or arbitration if it's legal under state law, but the state cannot enforce Sharia within public law. In other words, you cannot have a religious court overriding your civil rights. Now, what we may see more of in New York, as we are in places like the UK, are Sharia councils, and these are informal or quasi-legal bodies which provide advice and mediation for members of the Muslim community on family matters such as divorce, inheritance, marriage, and they are not courts in the full legal sense, and they cannot override the existing UK or US law, but outcomes must remain consistent with the existing laws. Now, some critics have raised concerns about gender equality, example, women's rights in divorce, transparency, parallel legal systems, and so forth. But supporters argue that they'll help Muslim communities navigate religious obligations and civil law more easily. So in big cities with large Muslim populations, Sharia law can play a role in personal law for those who choose it, but it remains subordinate to secular law, for now anyway. Now, this may be pretty interesting to see develop because politically, a mayor with a Muslim identity may face community expectations around religious values, but he or she must govern under secular law for all residents. Now let's once again bring it back to the good herb, smoking weed and drinking under Sharia law or Islam. Now in Islam, the consumption of alcohol and recreational intoxicants is prohibited. It's haram. The Quran forbids it in several verses, and many scholars extend this to any substance that clouds the mind, which many would argue include recreational cannabis. Now, when it comes to weed specifically, while some Islamic scholars debate medicinal cannabis and its permissibility, recreational use is broadly considered impermissible, especially under classical Islamic jurisprudence, simply because of intoxication. If a Muslim is caught with or using weed in a jurisdiction where it's illegal, then secular laws apply. Fines and criminal penalties may be levied. In certain countries where Muslim law is enforced, punishments may be even harsher, including large fines, imprisonment, or even corporal and punitive sentences in some jurisdictions, especially where Islamic law is more strictly applied. In some countries with strict Islamic legal code, the penalties for drug trafficking, even cannabis, can be extremely severe, including long-term imprisonment or even death, depending on the country and the amount. So that said, for a Muslim individual, recreational weed and alcohol are problematic, both religiously and in some places legally. For a city mayor who is Muslim, this may influence how he thinks about drug policy, community standards, outreach to Muslim communities, and also regulation. So let's discuss how Zohran Mamdani's culture and religion could impact New York City's cannabis industry. And putting it all together, there are a few ways that his identity and politics could influence the legal weed industry for New York City. Now, first off, when it comes to equity and inclusion, given his background, Mamdani may emphasize equity in cannabis licensing, ensuring that communities that were disproportionately affected by prohibition, for instance, immigrant neighborhoods or people of color, they get meaningful access to licenses, jobs, and also business opportunities. But also community reinvestment. His platform emphasized affordability, public investment, and housing. He may require that cannabis tax revenues be reinvested into impacted communities, education, and social services, rather than simply licensing fees going into general coffers. There's also the regulatory lens. Because of his socialist public service orientation, he might push for stronger public oversight of the cannabis industry, licensing, cost control, preventing monopolies, local benefits agreement, and the like, rather than simply letting the market run wild. There's also a cultural sensitivity. As a Muslim mayor, he may be more sensitive to the concerns of Muslim communities, where recreational intoxication is religiously disfavored. This could potentially lead to policies which aim to balance adult use expansion with community standards, education, and outreach to religious or conservative neighborhoods. And of course, his public acknowledgement of purchasing weed signals openness to adult use. This could send strong market messages to entrepreneurs, and that message could be that New York is serious about cannabis business under his leadership. Now, it's not all rainbows, because on the flip side, we can have some potentially large problems. If his community outreach emphasizes sobriety or alternative lifestyles, then there may be tension between a liberal adult use policy and conservative community expectations. The industry may need to navigate that, especially in neighborhoods with large Muslim or immigrant populations. So in short, Mamdani can bring a both-and approach when it comes to cannabis in New York City. Adult use expansion plus equity plus community oversight plus culturally inclusive frameworks. And what this might mean is slower but more focused growth of the cannabis industry in New York City with more guardrails and social purpose. But as we know, more regulation and slow progress is definitely not what we need in the cannabis community. So it'll be really interesting to see how all of this plays out. So to recap, what does Zohran Mamdani mean for weed in New York City? Well, his public admission of purchasing from a legal dispensary signals openness to the adult use market. His background and political identity suggest that he may emphasize equity, community benefit, regulation, and fairness in how the cannabis industry evolves. His democratic socialist orientation implies that he will treat cannabis not just as a business or a revenue source, but as part of a broader social justice agenda. Essentially, we may see more DEI in the cannabis industry over in New York. In essence, he will try to repair past harms, elevate communities impacted by prohibition, and ensure public benefit. At the same time, his Muslim identity and immigrant community connections may lead him to balance adult use expansion with culturally sensitive outreach and possibly stricter local regulation or oversight in certain neighborhoods. So for entrepreneurs, retailers, and investors, this could mean that New York under Mamdani could be a partial green light for growth, but also likely a very complex regulatory landscape with social justice criteria and community-first principles being applied and balanced with his Muslim background. And stepping back and looking at the bigger picture, his victory marks a shift in urban politics. The largest U.S. city electing a Muslim Democrat socialist mayor signals that political winds are changing. The cannabis industry, which which is rapidly professionalizing and becoming mainstream, sits at the intersection of business culture, justice, and regulation. And if you're in the legal weed space in New York City, operators, investors, brand builders, or community advocates, this is a moment to pay attention. The rules of the game may shift. The emphasis may tilt from pure profit to equity, community, and regulated growth. And above all, social purpose will matter. So all that said, how do you think a Democrat socialist mayor should regulate the cannabis industry over in New York? What's your take? Slower growth with heavier oversight and more regulations, or a free market with rapid expansion? Do you think New York City is in trouble or they're on the up? Drop it in the comments and let me know. Now, in our next episode, we're entering yet another week of the federal government shutdown, and it's turning out to be one of the longest in recorded history. It's absolutely crazy and it's shaking up the cannabis industry. So if you haven't seen that video, check it out. It's coming up right now.